In the heart of Norfolk, in the year 1758, a frail child came into the world. His name was Horatio Nelson. From the very beginning, people whispered that this boy would not live long. His body was delicate, his skin pale, and fever often burned through his veins, while other children ran freely across the fields, climbing trees and chasing one another in laughter. Horatio lay in bed, coughing, staring out of a small window at the wide, endless sky. His mother worried constantly, and neighbors shook their heads with pity. "The child is too weak," they said. "He may not survive to manhood." Yet, even in his weakest moments, when his small body trembled with illness, there was something in his eyes, a fire that refused to be put out. When Horatio was only 9 years old, tragedy struck. His mother, the one person who gave him comfort, passed away. The boy was crushed with grief, and for many days he sat in silence, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. Many thought this loss would break him completely. But grief, as cruel as it is, sometimes awakens a new kind of strength. From that moment, young Nelson began to carry within him a determination that surprised even those closest to him. At 12 years old, his father arranged for him to go to sea under the guidance of his uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling. When word spread that the fragile boy was to join the Royal Navy, people laughed. "He will not last a week," they said. "The sea is no place for someone so weak." And yet, on a brisk spring morning, Horatio stood at the harbor. His coat hung loosely from his thin shoulders. His hat was far too big for his head. Yet his eyes were fixed on the towering ships that loomed above the water. Their sails were like the wings of giants, filled with wind, ready to carry men into the unknown. For the first time in his life, Horatio felt small not because of weakness, but because of wonder. He whispered under his breath, words no one around him heard. "One day, the sea will know my name." Life at sea was harsher than anything the boy could have imagined. The days were long, the nights colder still. The food was rough, the work endless, and the dangers constant. Sailors mocked him for his size, for his coughing fits, for the way his thin hands struggled to haul ropes thicker than his arms. They gave him nicknames, laughed when he stumbled, coins on whether he would collapse before the first month was done. But Nelson endured. He endured the jeers, the exhaustion, the seasickness. Each failure became fuel for his resolve. Each fall became a lesson. Slowly, the laughter turned to silence. Slowly, the sailors began to see that the boy would not give up. Then came the storm. It was a tempest unlike any the crew had ever seen. Waves rose like mountains, smashing against the wooden sides of the ship. The wind screamed, tearing sails to ribbons, and rain lashed down like 1,000 whips. Seasoned sailors clung to the rigging, their faces pale with terror. Some prayed, some cursed, some wept openly. And there, in the midst of chaos, stood Horatio Nelson. His small body was soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his hands gripped the rail with unshakable strength. His eyes were fixed not on the storm, but on the horizon, as if daring the sea to break him. One officer, watching from a distance, would later recall, "The boy looked as though he belonged to the storm itself. He did not fear it, he welcomed it." When the storm finally passed, the crew was left shaken, broken, exhausted. Yet young Nelson still stood, weak in body, but alive with something greater, courage. That night, As the ship groaned and the sea calmed, Horatio sat alone in a quiet corner. With a trembling hand, he opened his diary and wrote, "If the sea takes me, let it be as a fighter, not as a forgotten soul." And no one saw those words then, but they would echo throughout his life, like a vow he had made, not just to himself, but to destiny. From that day forward, Nelson was no longer the boy people doubted. He became the boy the sailors respected. They saw him fall sick. They saw him weaken. Yet each time, he rose again. They began to believe he carried something within him that illness could not crush and storms could not drown. As the years passed, Nelson continued to grow in knowledge and skill. He studied maps with an obsession, memorized the stars, and asked endless questions about ships, battles, and strategy. His mind was sharp, quick, and always restless. There is a story told by sailors. Some claim it is true, others say it is legend, that once, during a voyage in freezing waters near the Arctic, Nelson fell terribly ill. His fever was so high that many thought he would not survive the night. Yet even in that weakened state, he begged to be carried onto the deck. Wrapped in blankets, barely able to stand, he looked out at the icy horizon and whispered to the captain, "If I am to die, let it be here, under the open sky. Let me see the path of my destiny." He did not die. He survived once again, and with each survival, the men around him began to believe that Nelson was meant for something greater. The frail child of Norfolk, the boy no one thought would last, had become a sailor. And though he did not yet know it, his name would one day shake the oceans of the world. Years passed, and the sickly boy from Norfolk transformed into a young officer of the Royal Navy. He was no longer mocked for his weakness. Instead, he was admired for a fire that seemed to burn brighter each time the sea tried to break him. But greatness is never gifted freely. It is forged in suffering, paid for in blood. Nelson's rise through the ranks was not without cost. His body carried the scars of his ambition. He was still young when he took command in the Caribbean. The sun was merciless, the diseases deadlier than the battles, and yet Nelson led with a sharp mind and relentless spirit. He demanded discipline, but he also earned loyalty. His men knew that their captain was not a distant figure of authority. He was one of them, willing to face the same storms, the same hunger, and the same fear. But destiny, as always, tested him cruelly. During one mission, Nelson contracted a fever so violent that the doctors gave up hope. His body shook with chills, his breath came in shallow gasps, and even he believed that death was near. Yet, once again, he defied it. When he opened his eyes days later, weak but alive, he whispered to the surgeon at his side, "I will not die. Not before I've done something that makes the world remember my name." It was not just illness that sought to break him. Battle too left its mark. At the siege of Calvi in Corsica, Nelson was struck by flying debris. The impact was devastating. Blood filled his vision. When the pain finally subsided, he realized he could no longer see with his right eye. For most men, such a wound would have meant the end of a career. But Nelson, half blind and battered, refused to step aside. He carried on with the same determination, commanding with one eye what others could not with two. He would later joke, in moments of lightheartedness, "I have only one eye, but I can still see the path to victory." The years later, another battle would demand an even greater sacrifice. In 1797, during the assault on Tenerife, Nelson led his men with boldness that bordered on reckless courage. As he charged forward, cannon fire thundered, muskets roared, and the air was thick with smoke. Amid the chaos, a musket ball tore through his arm. He collapsed, pain shooting through his body like fire. Carried below deck, Nelson knew the truth. Before the surgeon spoke, his right arm was shattered beyond saving. With grim determination, he gave the order himself. Do it quickly. Cut it off. The amputation was brutal. No anesthesia, no mercy. Only pain, searing and endless. The young admiral gritted his teeth, refusing to cry out, though his body shook with agony. When it was done, when the blood had been stopped, he lay pale and exhausted. Many thought his career was finished. What commander could fight wars, could lead men with only one eye and one arm? But Nelson was not most men. Within weeks, still weak, still learning how to live with one arm, he wrote a letter to the Admiralty. In it, he declared, "I may have lost my arm, but I have not lost my spirit. My heart, my mind, my loyalty, these remain, and with them I shall yet serve England." And serve he did. His men marveled at his resilience. They saw a man whose body was broken, yet whose will was iron. They saw a leader who would never ask of them what he would not give himself. His scars became symbols, not of weakness, but of defiance. But Nelson's battles were not only against enemies on the sea. He wrestled with doubt, with loneliness, with the shadows of mortality that followed him everywhere. Late at night, when the deck was quiet and the stars reflected on the dark waters, he would often stand alone, gazing at the horizon. He knew that each day could be his last, that the sea could claim him at any moment. And yet, in those solitary hours, he repeated the vow he had made as a boy. "If the sea takes me, let it be as a fighter, not as a forgotten soul." There is a story told by a sailor who served under him of a night after the loss of his arm. The crew was restless, many shaken by the sight of their admiral wounded so terribly. Nelson, sensing their unease, gathered them on deck. The moonlight shone on his pale face, his empty sleeve pinned neatly to his coat. He raised his remaining arm high and said with a fierce smile, "You see before you a man half, blind and one armed. And yet I tell you this England is whole, our duty is whole, and as long as I draw breath, I will fight for her with everything I have left. So long as I live, none of you will fight alone." The men roared with cheers, their doubts silenced, their courage renewed. In that moment, Nelson was more than a commander. He was the living embodiment of resilience. The years that followed only proved it further. With one eye and one arm, he outmaneuvered enemies, shattered fleets, and inspired fear in those who opposed him. His victories were not the victories of a man untouched by hardship, but of a man who carried his wounds like banners of strength. By the end of the century, whispers had begun to spread across Europe. Admirals in foreign navies spoke his name with unease. Sailors told stories of him as if he were half man, legend, a commander who could not be broken, who would always return to the sea, no matter what it took from him. And Nelson himself. He carried on, scarred and weary, yet driven by the same vow that had guided him since boyhood. The sea could strip him of his health, his eye, his arm, one day even his life, but it would never strip him of his destiny. The turn of the century brought with it storms. greater than any the seas could conjure. Across Europe, a single name dominated the whispers of kings and the fears of generals. Napoleon Bonaparte. His armies swept across the land like fire, crushing kingdoms, reshaping borders, and daring to challenge Britain's rule of the waves. For England, the sea was not just a frontier, it was survival itself. And for the sea, England had Nelson. By now, Nelson was no stranger to sacrifice. He bore his scars openly. The blind eye, the empty sleeve. To some, he looked more ghost than man, but to his men, he was the embodiment of defiance. They followed him not out of duty alone, but out of belief. Belief that if Nelson stood at the helm, no enemy could prevail. In 1798, that belief would be tested. The French fleet, vast and confident, had sailed to Egypt, carrying with it the hope of cutting Britain's lifeline to India. If Napoleon succeeded, the world would tilt in his favor. Nelson was tasked with finding and destroying that fleet. But the Mediterranean was wide, and the French hid well. For weeks, Nelson searched. His ships scoured the seas, chasing rumors, battling exhaustion. Supplies ran thin, men grew restless, and doubt crept in. Some whispered that the French had slipped through, that Nelson's pursuit was hopeless. But Nelson refused to yield. He drove his fleet forward, his one good eye scanning the horizon, trusting instinct where maps and reports failed. And then, at last, he found them. The French fleet lay anchored in Aboukir Bay, their ships lined up in confident order, their decks lit with the warm glow of evening lanterns. They did not expect Nelson. They believed the bay itself, shallow and treacherous, would protect them. But they had underestimated the man who had defied storms, wounds, and death itself. Nelson saw not danger, but opportunity. With boldness that stunned even his own officers, he ordered his fleet to sail directly into the narrow waters, attacking not from the front, but between the French ships and the shore. A maneuver so daring that many believed it. Madness. The battle that followed was thunder made flesh. Cannon fire roared, the night sky split with fire and smoke. Ships burned, men screamed, the very sea seemed to boil. Nelson's flagship, HMS Vanguard, blazed forward, leading the charge. He stood on deck, unflinching, shouting orders, with a voice that cut through the chaos like steel. Hours later, when the smoke cleared, the French fleet lay shattered. 11 ships of the line destroyed, their pride humbled, their power broken. Napoleon's dreams of empire in the East crumbled before they had even begun. News of the victory, the Battle of the Nile, spread across Europe like wildfire. For the first time, Napoleon had been checked. It was Nelson's hand that had struck the blow. In England, church bells rang. Crowds gathered in the streets. Nelson's name was spoken with reverence. He was no longer just an admiral. He was a savior. But Nelson himself, though celebrated, carried the weight of the battle in silence. He had seen too much death, too much destruction, to revel in glory. In private, he wrote in his diary, "I am but a man, scarred and weary. Yet if destiny calls me, I will rise again, for my life is not my own. It belongs to England." And destiny was far from finished with him. Over the next years, Nelson continued to fight, his victories mounting, his legend growing. At Copenhagen, he faced the Danish fleet. The battle raged, fierce and bloody, and at one point, his commander signaled a retreat. But Nelson, with that infamous stubbornness, raised his telescope to his blind eye and said, with a wry smile, "I really do not see the signal." And he pressed the attack, turning certain defeat into triumph. It was acts like these, reckless to some, brilliant to others, that carved his name deeper into the stone of history. He did not merely fight battles, he rewrote them. By now, even his enemies spoke of him with respect and fear. Sailors in foreign ports told tales of the one-eyed, one-armed admiral who commanded the sea like a man chosen by fate itself. Mothers warned their children with his name, and kings cursed it. But for his men, he was not a myth. He was flesh and blood, scarred but unyielding, a leader who stood among them, who inspired them to believe that no force in the world could break their spirit so long as Nelson stood at the helm. As the new century dawned, Nelson stood at the height of his fame. He had risen from a frail boy in Norfolk to a living legend, a man whose very presence could turn the tide of war. Yet deep within, he knew the truth. Every victory carried a cost, and destiny, though generous, always demanded payment in the end. But Nelson did not fear that reckoning. He had already made his vow. If the sea took him, it would not be as a forgotten soul. And with each victory, with each scar, he etched his name deeper into the memory of the world. The rise of a legend was complete. The only question that remained was how that legend would end. By 1805, Europe stood on the edge of a knife. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of the continent, had only one obstacle left: the Royal Navy. If he could break Britain's command of the seas, his armies would march across the Channel, and England itself would fall. The French and Spanish fleets gathered, mighty in number, their sails darkening the horizon. And standing between them and England was one man's Admiral Horatio Nelson. By now, Nelson's body was a map of sacrifice. One eye gone, one arm lost, scars etched across his flesh, pain a constant companion. Yet his spirit blazed brighter than ever. He knew this battle would be his greatest test. He also knew it might be his last. On the morning of October 21st, 1805, as the sun broke through the mist off Cape Trafalgar, Nelson stood upon the deck of HMS Victory. The wind carried the scent of salt and powder, the creak of wood, the murmur of thousands of men preparing for war. Around him stretched his fleet, fewer ships than the enemy, but each manned by sailors who believed utterly in their commander. Nelson addressed them not with long speeches, but with words that would echo through history. A simple signal, hoisted high upon the mast, fluttering in the morning breeze. England expects that every man will do his duty. The cheer that followed shook the very timbers of the ship. Men beat their fists against the railings, shouted until their throats burned, and looked to Nelson with a devotion that words could never capture. They would fight, they would bleed, they would die if needed, because Nelson asked it of them. The fleets closed. Cannon thunder filled the air, smoke rolled across the sea, and the Battle of Trafalgar began. Nelson, as always, placed himself where the danger was greatest. His one good eye scanned the chaos. His voice rang out with clarity, his presence a beacon amidst the storm of war. The French and Spanish ships fought fiercely, their numbers overwhelming, but Nelson's strategy was bold, brilliant, and utterly unexpected. He split his fleet into two columns, driving them directly into the enemy line, smashing through their formation with a fury no one had anticipated. It was not just battle, it was destiny being written in fire and iron. Hours passed, the sea boiling with shot and flame. Nelson remained on deck, refusing to seek shelter, his coat bright against the smoke, his figure unmistakable. To his men, he was not just their admiral. He was the spirit of England itself, standing unbroken. But destiny had one final demand. As Nelson strode across the deck, giving orders, a musket ball fired from the French ship Redoutable struck him. He staggered, collapsed, and was carried below. His men, horrified, at the heart of Defied, whispered that the heart of the fleet had been struck down. In the dim light below deck, Nelson lay pale, his breath shallow. The surgeon knew the wound was mortal. Yet Nelson did not cry out. Instead, he asked only one question. How goes the battle? When told that the day was theirs, that the enemy was breaking, Nelson's lips curved into the faintest smile. He whispered, I have done my duty. Even as life slipped from him, he thought not of himself, but of his country, his men, his vow. He lived long enough to know that his fleet had triumphed, that England was safe, that Napoleon's dream of invading Britain was shattered forever. Above deck, as the battle raged on, word spread that Nelson had fallen. The men fought with a fury beyond human measure, determined to honor him. And when at last the smoke cleared, when the waves calmed, the French and Spanish fleets lay broken. Trafalgar was victory. Trafalgar was immortality. But Nelson did not live to see the end. His body, broken but unbowed, gave out before the guns, fell silent. In his final breath, he murmured words that have echoed through centuries. Bless England. When news of his death reached home, the nation wept. Bells tolled, crowds filled the streets in mourning. Yet amidst the grief, there was pride. Nelson had given everything: his youth, his health, his eye, his arm, his life. And in return, he had given England freedom. And so, the boy once too weak to climb a tree, the frail child whom neighbors believed would not live to manhood, became a legend who lived forever. His vow was fulfilled. The sea had taken him, yes, but not as a forgotten soul. As a fighter, as a leader, as a name that the world would never forget. Horatio Nelson, broken, yet unbroken.